Masquerade Summit in Zimbabwe, welcome to our channel Zen Confessions and Deep Secrets. Kana kariki kutanka kukuya panino channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Kana uchungwaga waka subscriber, don't forget to comment and share this video. Nasimure Zimbabwe, takuigirai nyabuditswa na South African Member of Parliament and opposition politician Vamusi Maimani Avabuda. During an interview yavangavaichiita neSABC vachitaura ivo vachikola the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa kuti akati maties neZimbabwe, achitaura iye achiti the evil iri kuitika muZimbabwe inokwanisa kuaffect zvakare South Africa, chizi magwabiswa okuti human rights muZimbabwe akunomira mushe, as Zimbabwe should interfere and make sure South Africa should interfere and make sure kuti issue maZimbabweans yasolvwa, since South Africa Ramaphosa should not attend the Sadc Summit. The Director of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa valamola vakabuda zvitaura ivo vachiti South Africa ina simba rekuchinja the Sadc venue, since the issues ari muZimbabwe anokwanisa kusolvwa chete nedialogue, but Musi Maimani vataura vachiti dialogue haishande panyaya yeabuse human rights muZimbabwe. Vakataura ivo vachiti South Africa ngaipindire igadzirise nyaya iyoyi. Ramaphosa vakaatenda this summit, it shows kuti vaindosa kuabuswa kwokuitwa human rights muZimbabwe. Tingati kusta nguva inototi kungonzwa zvataurwa naVamusi Maimani in this interview. Mwamadzi zvamuri kufunga pamusoro penyaya iyi mucomment section.
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. Zimbabwe is in a deep crisis. And that crisis is fundamentally because the opposition there has been treated like criminals in a country of their birth, where they feel they have convictions to fight for the people of Zimbabwe. Opposition members have been arrested, some disappearing, and this is not a recent thing. It has happened as far back as when President Robert Mugabe was president. So a simple statement by the South African government saying it is observing a situation where even when elections were held in Zimbabwe, the Sadc Observer Mission declared that those elections were not free and fair, I think is a dereliction of duty by South Africa. It is ultimately turning a blind eye to a crisis of injustice. And no dialogue is going to resolve a violation of human rights. And therefore, I want to call and urgently state that it is time, given that we're in a state of a government of national unity, a new posture as South Africa, that in fact we move and refuse to not only participate in the Sadc, but to ultimately have it move to a country upon which human rights are upheld. I think ultimately we need a change of positioning here. We cannot be selective in where we choose to condemn violations of human rights. We need to be consistent as a country, and that's the reset that at the very least this government can take. We must restore that what is an ANC-ZANU-PF relationship cannot be synonymous with a South African government and parliamentary responsibility as it speaks to the issue of Zimbabwe. We will tomorrow lament the fact that there is immigration that is taking place by Zimbabweans into South Africa. We will lament many things. But actually the beginning point would have been the stabilization of Zimbabwe. A stable Zimbabwe is good for South Africa, but it is not going to be stable if we are turning a blind eye to the issues that are taking place there. And therefore, I really believe there's an opportunity here for us to stand strong, stand for human rights, make a bold declaration. When even prior to these elections, when President Ramaphosa attended the inauguration, I thought to me was a betrayal of Sadc, because already there was a declaration that the elections were not free and fair. Now is an opportunity to reset all of that. And there's a massive opportunity and a burden of responsibility for South Africa to uphold here, where it in fact must be the ones who look after human rights. Botswana goes to elections next. Are we going to sit back and watch if any of violations take place in the same country? We cannot be selective in our condemnation of human rights. And therefore, I would call on Minister Ronald Lamola the President of South Africa, and the South African diplomatic corps to stand strong and simply reject the fact that what is going on there is correct, stay away from the summit, or have it moved to a different country where human rights are upheld. The only way to restore the credibility of Zimbabwe is to allow for democracy to thrive. That's about, as I've alluded to, holding free and fair elections, but actually allowing the opposition to exist. This is something that as South Africa, I must applaud the ANC for having upheld in our country, where if you are in the opposition of any kind, you are allowed to say and do what you'd like, mobilize as you want. Zimbabwe must enjoy the same right. Why can't we fight for it there? Because when the people of Zimbabwe feel that the election results are free and fair, that their opposition leaders can be able to stand up and be able to operate as freely as they can, it's only then and then only can you stabilize the country. You can build an economy that works. You can have ultimately constitutional democracy being held in Zimbabwe. That's one of the ways. Because when I speak to Zimbabweans who are in South Africa, many of them would much rather be in their own country of birth because they want to be closer to their family and to the systems that work in Zimbabwe. Very few citizens actually immigrate in this particular instance because they have some form of ulterior desire for South Africa. They want to live in a country that is prosperous. We must give them that right to do so. And the best way to stem the immigration tide is to stabilize Zimbabwe and ensure that it is a prosperous country, which it can be. So South Africa's posture that simply says, no, well, if we allow democracy to fail in Zimbabwe, we hopefully will be able to secure our borders sufficiently that Zimbabweans cannot come in, would be a simple misnomer and a poor strategy. I would suggest that it hasn't worked since the Zimbabwean government of national unity. Now is the time for us to, in fact, reset that relationship, be strong on Zimbabwe, and make it unequivocal that we are not going to tolerate violations of human rights. Even if it wasn't about immigration, a fellow African being killed by Africans is a violation of the very principle of Ubuntu and solidarity and must be condemned by all peace-loving and democracy-loving Africans. It says if you are an ally, a former ally of the government, you are allowed to get away with violations of human rights. And we as South Africa can be selective as to how and when we choose to condemn human rights. It sends a message of ambiguity and inconsistency. It sends a message that actually African lives don't matter. Another way of putting it would be to say black lives don't matter, given that we must concede that not all Africans are black, but we must recognize that in fact this means the message we are sending to the world. And we cannot afford that given our own history. As Africans, as South Africans, we came from a history of brutality and oppression. We cannot allow it to happen right in front of us. We should be at the forefront of fighting for it. And therefore, whether it is happening in Zimbabwe, whether it is happening in another part of Africa, we must condemn it as we would in any other place. So I'm urging again that South Africa's foreign policy must always be based on human rights. It must be based on trade, and it must be consistent in how it approaches these issues so that the international community can trust our historically principled position that simply says that an evil across the fence is an evil everywhere, and it in fact affects all of us as Africans.